Well, good morning. How wonderful to see that we're still here and we're still going and we're still working on policy and reform. But before I go any further, I would like to thank Auntie Violet for her acknowledgement of country and express my respect for the leaders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present and emerging. We are on Aboriginal land, and I, for one, am very happy that the Tent Embassy, source of so many wrangles and fights and dramas over the years, is still there to remind us. Well, you would have noticed that less than a fortnight ago, on the 11th of November, Australia marked the armistice, the end of the terrible First World War. The same day, we marked another ending, one of equal significance for Australia, the premature and shocking end of the first progressive federal government Australia had had in 23 years. The Whitlam government was thrown out of office on the 11th of the 11th, 1975, not by the people who elected it, but by an unelected official in what many maintain to this day was an unconstitutional act. The traumatic and premature conclusion of the Whitlam government was a shock and a huge disappointment to many Australians. For Australian women, it was particularly damaging. The Whitlam government from 1972 to 1975 was the first national government to implement a big reform agenda for women, to involve women, including at the highest levels, and to move with purpose and effective action towards the objective of a society in which men and women of Australia would be equals in every way. The government made huge progress, and we've heard quite a lot of it from Tanya's wonderful speech, and it would have made much more if not cut off midway by the traumatic dismissal and the subsequent overwhelming electoral defeat. But let's go back to 1972. That year, for the politically engaged, was full of excitement and promise. The promise was that after 23 years of a lacklustre Conservative rule, Australians could elect an ambitious, reforming government, led by Gough Whitlam with style, energy, comprehensive scope and massive plans for a better Australia for all. Labor seemed well prepared to take power and set Australia on a welcome new direction. The defining narrative of this new direction was opportunity, equal opportunity for all. The government intended to put in place purposeful and effective measures to deal with the inequalities and disadvantages that many citizens had suffered over a long time. The fair go sentiment Australians love to claim as defining them had in fact excluded many of us: Aborigines, migrants, the poor, and of course the biggest group not included in the fair go idea was us, Australian women. No fair go for us. The Whitlam government came into office in December 1972, well prepared to make success of this historic opportunity. Whitlam himself had developed detailed policy papers on all matters important to creating fairness, equal opportunity and economic progress. Comprehensive policy was developed for education, health, improvements to our cities and suburbs, protection of the environment. Labor wanted land rights for the first Australians and would provide properly for the needs of newly arrived migrants. In foreign policy and defence, Labor planned to establish a new dynamic role for Australia in our region and the world. Manufacturing, our agricultural sectors, all of these parts of Australia had been considered and reforms planned. Australian culture was to be acknowledged, celebrated and supported. It's fair to say, however, that these comprehensive preparations had not included any detailed investigations into policies for overcoming the many disadvantages suffered at the time by Australian women. Australia in this respect was backward, patriarchal, discriminatory. Women were, in most respects, forced into living as second-class citizens. Labor did have a historic commitment to equal pay, and Whitlam himself intended to use international instruments of the UN and the ILO as building blocks for women's progress. But the Labor Party, along with its industrial partner, the trade union movement, was similar to all other powerful institutions in Australia in this respect. It had operated without including women at senior or decision-making levels, hence the sparsity of policies to advance the rights of women. So how was it then that the Whitlam government, on assuming office, immediately became active in all manner of reforms for women? And by 1975, when taking part in the first ever United Nations Conference on Women, the Mexico Conference, had changed Australia so that it was seen as a world leader in women's rights. And I have to say, Elizabeth Reed's speech at that conference was regarded by all as the best speech of the conference. Correctly. We'll hear more from Elizabeth soon. Now, how did Whitlam go from having no real detailed policy about women to world leader status? Well, the answer is the women's electoral lobby. You all know what that was and what we did. Many of you here today played a key role in that extraordinary and successful drama. But for our younger guests and for others who might not remember, here we go. By the beginning of 1972, women's liberation, abortion law reform advocacy and feminism generally was developing fast in Australia. There are a number of factors driving this big cultural shift. The improvements in women's access to university education, though slow, was starting to produce young women able to question the sexist status quo and confident enough to do something about it. The involvement of women in the anti-Vietnam War movement had exposed them, mostly for the first time, to radical action, how to do it and how to get impact. The contraceptive pill had come into our lives, a measure of reproductive control, a ticket to freedom that many of us seized with enthusiasm, great enthusiasm. Observing the early success of a national women's lobby during the United States presidential election, a group of Melbourne women organised by Beatrice Faust formed a plan. The plan was to question all candidates in the forthcoming federal election on their understanding of women's circumstances and the degree to which they would commit to pro-women reforms. Now, at this point, I will pay tribute to Beatrice Faust, who died recently. Her contribution was immense, and I would attribute a big, even crucial role to her in the subsequent success of what became the Women's Electoral Lobby. So, Vale, Dr. Beatrice Faust AO. Well, following quickly upon the Melbourne meeting, women's lobbies groups formed in Sydney and Melbourne, and before long they sprang up, and here in Canberra, and before long they sprang up all over Australia, including regional and country Australia and the far north, even Darwin. It's hard but invigorating to explain now how the lobby grew so fast and how bold and effective we were. The Well questionnaire for federal candidates consisted of 45 detailed questions. No tick and flick. It was stunning in its range and incisiveness. Thanks to Josepha Sobski, a national convener of Well These Days, a Sydney original, and Gail Radford, a convener of the first Canberra Well group, and these days a historian of Well, I recently got a copy of that questionnaire and some of the results. Wow, as our kids would say. Wow. In summary, it started up front, no easy lead-in. It started with birth control and abortion questions and explored through several hard questions how such services could be set up, how they could be funded and who would run them. Far from the yes-no binary questions of the kind we're used to today, the questionnaire asked detailed and specific questions. Sales tax on contraceptives and the advertising of contraceptives were covered early in the questionnaire. Logically, the questionnaire moved on to attitudes to sex education in schools. It then moved to female poverty, a huge issue at the time when divorce was rare and available mainly only to the rich, when single mothers got no financial support, whether they were unmarried, deserted or had husbands in prison. Women were denied work on the basis of sex and sacked if they became mothers. They had access only to low-paid jobs without promotion prospects, the female work ghetto, which sadly has not disappeared from the workplace environment today. Interestingly, in the questionnaire, the neglect of fathers rearing children alone was also pinpointed as requiring attention. Childcare, a massive gap in public provision, which often became an insuperable barrier to women taking a job, was the subject of several questions detailed as to funding, access, provision and operation hours. And yes, the much feared and loathed concept of 24-hour childcare was indeed raised. Divorce was covered and the possibility of reforms in access, cost and administration. The huge matter of sex discrimination in the workforce, including unequal and poor pay, inflexible hours and denial of workforce training, was explored. The extension of the minimum wage to women was an objective, as was paid maternity leave. Again, moving on logically, girls and schooling, then blatantly discriminatory, was the subject of several detailed questions. There were more. But the final question was one that I think could be raised with relevance today. Would you support or oppose the setting up of a royal commission or a Senate inquiry into the status of women in Australia? Well, what happened? In short, most federal candidates answered the questionnaire. The answers were assessed by Well Women, rated and publicised. By that time, the media was interested and some female journalists were on side. Now, in the assessments, Labor candidates fared better, much better, than their Conservative opponents. Top scorer was Tom Wren. And Bill Hayden and Gough Whitlam were right up there too. This exercise, the Well questionnaire, made a difference. The main difference was this: Labor was elected. The part played by the women's movement in this victory was recognised. True to its commitment, the new government, initially a government of two ministers, Gough and Lance Barnard, day one, and from that moment, the commitments made in answers to the Well questionnaire were turned into government policy. And many of those commitments will be the subject of other contributions today. So it's important to recognise the reality, the historical reality of what happened. You could say Whitlam's women's reform agenda was in fact designed and advocated and later guided by women themselves through a voluntary grassroots movement. It achieved much, and Tanya listed those things off, but I'll just remind you: the reopening of the equal pay case, the extension of the minimum wage to women, paid maternity leave in the public service, establishing a single mother's benefit, abolishing university fees, cheap and accessible contraception, accessible no-fault divorce, and investigating for the first time the structural and cultural discrimination in girls in our schools, and universal health insurance, of course. The list could go on, but in aggregate, the changes as they affected women's lives and opportunities amounted to a social revolution, our revolution. But because of the dismissal and subsequent electoral defeat of the government, much of this planned revolution was left as unfinished business. This women's business, the unfinished business, remained on hold during the 7 Fraser years. Some things went backwards. When Labor finally achieved power again under Bob Hawke in 1983, I was thrilled and honoured to be appointed to Cabinet with responsibilities that include taking up this unfinished business on behalf of women. And I think any fair assessment of the Hawke-Keating era would agree that most of our own campaign commitments to women, which were extensive, and the remaining Whitlam undertakings were delivered on. But, of course, women are still not equal. Some old problems, lack of equal pay, exclusion from a fair share of powerful roles, continue. New or newly recognised problems going to women's personal safety at home as well as in the community have flared up to epidemic proportions. A global campaign has put the spotlight on the shocking extent of sexual harassment in the workplace, all workplaces. When women leaders of today, especially young emerging leaders, look for strategies to combat these current attacks on women's rights, they could and should take heart from revisiting 1972 to 1975 and studying what well achieved. This movement of grassroots women without any institutional or financial backing, utilising only our own determination, energy and abilities, took collective action that contributed to a progressive government creating a social revolution for women. It is time to recognise, celebrate, but most importantly, to recreate this approach in the contemporary political landscape. That is my hope for today. Thank you.